Hello, my little Nerdy-Nawg dogs. I am so sorry that we had technical difficulty today. I'm going to kind of zoom through what we would have done this morning. And thank you for bearing with us, right? Flexible is functional, so sometimes we just have to be a little flexible to get through. Well, today is week 3, day 1 of our writer's workshop. And so what I would have done in class with you looks something like this. Today we went through our sentence spotlight and we identified different parts of speech. So while you go along with me on this really quickly, obviously not as much fun without having your feedback, but we do like to look to our mentor writers and these great authors who write really unique sentences and try to replicate. So for instance, if we're looking at this sentence here, and this is in your pink packet, so if you can fill it out, that would be great. The sentence is from the book Holes. It banged against his chest as he ran, and every time it hit against him, it reminded him that it was empty, empty, empty. So my question to you first, right off the bat, would be, what does that empty, empty, empty do? Well, as an author, sometimes we use these different techniques, and repetition helps make something stand out. It brings our attention to it, right? So by repeating the words empty, 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 he really emphasizes that it was empty inside. Oh no. So I would say what we notice is empty repeating is kind of a big deal. Another question I might ask you about this is this a complex sentence? Is it a compound sentence? We know it's not a simple sentence, right? Agreed. Nerdy-Nawg dogs. Okay. So we would say that this is a compound sentence. And that is because I could make 2 separate sentences out of this and combine it, right? I could get rid of that and throw a period in here. And then we could read, it banged against his chest as he ran, period. And make this a capital. And this would be the second sentence. And then we would say, every time it hit against him, it reminded him that it was empty, empty, empty. So in this case, we would say this is a compound sentence. Now here's another thing. Compound sentences are actually complex sentences as well. Okay. Now, mind you, it is written as a complex sentence, meaning that instead of putting a period and making it 2 sentences and combining it, they made it complex by keeping it as one. So as we take apart these sentence spotlights, what else do you notice? I always ask you about perspective. So is this told in first person, meaning the main character is telling the story, or is this third person, omnipresent? There's a little clue in this sentence. It banged against his chest as he ran, and every time it hit against him, it reminded him that it was empty, empty, empty. So this is told in third person. We haven't had one of these sentences yet. And we know that because it's saying as he ran, it banged against his chest. So it's not the narrator telling the story. Okay, now let's look at our parts of speech. Again, it's so much more fun when you guys are here to tell me rather than me just telling you, but please add this to your page. If we're talking about verbs, the action words, where are the verbs in this? Verb being it banged, right? So that would be a verb. Ran, that's an action word, that's a verb. Reminded, that's something happening. What happened? He was reminded. That's a verb. If I'm asking you for the nouns, remember the nouns are the person, place, or thing. In this case, one noun would be his chest. Another noun might be, ooh, this is a tricky one. You guys ready for this one? It's one of my favorite types of nouns. Time. Time is an abstract noun, meaning it's not a tangible thing that I can pick up and hold. Time is abstract. Love is abstract noun, right? In this case, it's time. Time is abstract. Um, there's some pronouns in here. If you remember, pronouns take the place of naming the noun. So in this case, his is a pronoun. He is a pronoun. Him is a pronoun. Two hims. There's another set of pronouns in here. Do you know what it could be? It. It is taking the place of identifying what it is. Those are pronouns. Okay. Now for our adjectives. Adjectives, descriptive word, empty, empty, empty. Those are adjectives. Every is describing the time. How many time? What kind of time? Every time. That becomes an adjective. Okay, so there's a lot more we could identify in there, but those are the main parts of speech. Now, of course, comes your task where you need to scaffold the sentence and then make it your own. So for example, if I were going to scaffold my sentence, I might say something like this. It clanked against his head, and every time it hit against him, it reminded him that it was hurting, hurting, hurting. Okay, and now as I make it my own, I want to fit within that same framework of the author and use the same cadence, I might call that, meaning the same pattern and speech pattern, but make it my own. So if I were to do that, I might say something like, it stood in the corner of my room, and each time I saw it, I remembered that I made that. I made that. I made that. Okay, so now is your time, my Nerdy-Nawg dogs, to scaffold your sentence and make it your own. Ready, go. And if you need more time, of course, you can pause the video. Meanwhile, we're moving on. Today's mini lesson is picking a seed from a watermelon. What does that mean? Well, if we're picking a seed, it means that we're finding one fine little point to talk about. A watermelon is grandiose. So if I were talking about my first trip to Disneyland, that would be a watermelon, my friends. That's a big story because Disneyland is huge. You know, I could talk about when I walked in the gates, there were flower hills and I saw the train going by. And then I went on Space Mountain. Then I went on Rocky Mountain Road. And then I went on Matterhorn. And then I went and rode the race cars, right? I could talk on and on and on about my first day at Disneyland. I could add show not tells, right? I could smell the salty pretzel as I walked by the vendor. So there's all kinds of things I could write about, but guess what? Boring. In this big thing happened story, we whittle down the watermelon and we find one seed, one small detail to write about, and we stock it so full of details that it makes for a really interesting read. So before we go forward, here's what I want you thinking about. I want you thinking about that BTH criteria. So in our notes last week, we wrote about our small moment criteria. So we are writing a personal narrative now, and I call it BTH for big thing happens. Now, here is the criteria required for this story. Number one, it has to be true. Number two, It has to have happened to you. You're not telling the story of your mom or dad. You're telling the story of what happened to you specifically. Number 3, it has to showcase emotion, meaning for the reader to be interested in it, it has to show some sort of emotion. Mad, or the happiest you've ever been, or sad. It has to showcase emotion. That's what draws in the reader and keeps them interested in reading, okay? Now, it has to happen in a short amount of time. The stories are actually best when it happens in maybe 2 to 3 minutes of time. But the story overall cannot be more than 5 to 8 minutes. So it has to be true. It has to have happened to you. It has to showcase emotion. And it has to happen in a small amount of time. That's why a seed is important. We're not telling the story of Disneyland. We're telling the story of riding on Space Mountain. And the minute that buckle straps down and woo, you're off and riding, and next thing you know, you think you're going to run into a wall, and then it diverts. Okay, you're telling the story of that exciting moment. That's the big deal. Okay, so please add this page to your notebook page. Since this is just a video, you might need to press pause on my video, open up your composition book, and add this into your composition book. You can label this brainstorm for BTH, being the big thing happened. And it's watermelon versus seed. Great writers write about a big thing with lots of detail in a small moment. Okay, so what's not on this page yet, because we still need to add to it, is they do this by adding so much detail to that small moment. It really makes for an intriguing reading experience. Please pause the video and add that to your composition book. Ding! Okay. So for example, I've mentioned Disneyland, right? So Disneyland would be the watermelon. And I talk about my whole trip to Disneyland, starting with the gate and the entry and the flowers and the tram and Matterhorn and Space Mountain and blah, 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 blah. Boring. But then I could go to my seed and I could talk about the moment the seatbelt buckles for Space Mountain, right? That is a seed. Aha! In my case, what I'm going to share with you guys in tomorrow's lesson is what I'm going to write about, because I like to write at the same time as you. And so for tomorrow's lesson, if you recall, this is a really good space to go to. A couple days ago, we did some gathering and we wrote about our feelings, if you remember this feeling hand. And each fingertip was a different emotion and then an event that happened to us that we could write about. So I had an event on here like shock, right? I was totally shocked when I found out I was having twins. I thought I was just having a baby, and I go into the doctor, and so my seed could be the moment the doctor said, oh, here's the second heartbeat. Ah! That's a moment I could write about, right? Instead, with you guys, I'm going to write about a time when I was scared. And one of my items on there was my first independent trip out of the country. So that would be my watermelon, because there's a lot that I could write about. So I'm going to put independent trip to Costa Rica. I spent a month down in Costa Rica with a family that only spoke Spanish. I was trying to learn Spanish. Now, if I were to write about that, that would be a novel, because so much happens on that trip. I could write about getting on the plane. I could write about meeting my doña for the first time, meeting the family, having to use my little guidebook to try and find out what in the heck they were saying because I didn't know Spanish yet. So there's a lot that I could write about. It's a novel that I could write about. That's not the criteria of this story. This story is the seed, the small moment, and something big that happened. So I have two things that really stand out, and one would be a bus ride that I took. So I could tell about the moment I thought I was gonna fall off of the bus, went over a bump and I'm hanging out the door, and I thought that would be the end of my trip, right? So that's a big thing that happened in a small amount of time, but I didn't actually fall off. I was scared, so I'm not gonna write about that story. What I'm gonna write about is my doña was making me some fish soup. She cooked for me every night, right? She was making fish soup. And I don't like fish. And I was doing restaurant management at the time, so I didn't feel so good about how things were being cooked. And I did not want to eat it, but it was a big deal for me because it showed me that I was overcoming my fear. And so I'm going to write about, my seed is going to be the moment I ate the fish soup. Okay, so we'll talk about that in tomorrow's lesson. What I want you guys to do right now is I would like you underneath your notes there to create a T-chart, one side being the watermelon, one side being the seed. And I want you to come up with at least 3 watermelons and dwindle that down to a moment within that watermelon. Okay, so again, if I go back to my hand, because that's a really great gathering spot, I could write down all of these different happenings. Remember I told you about my kitty cat dying? So I could write about my kitty cat dying. Kitty, oh, made me so sad. So kitty cat dies. The seed in that I would want to write about, because it happened over time, right? I had to take her to the vet and drive her there, and I had to talk with the vet and have the vet check her out. And so if I need to write about a seed of that happening right there, I would write about the moment that the doctor gave my kitty cat the shot to put her to sleep. My kitty cat had cancer. So the moment, so this is really actually the kitty being sick. And this is the moment the doctor gave shot to the kitty cat, right? That still stays with me and causes emotion. Even just talking about it right now, it makes me so sad. So your seed has to be something that causes emotion. That's a really important thing here. Okay, so by the time you come to class tomorrow, I want you to have a T-chart made, and I would like you to list 3 watermelons, and from those watermelons, find the seed. The little detail in there that causes so much emotion, the big event that happened, the big thing happened, BTH, in a short amount of time. Okay, that is your writing lesson for today. Nice to see you, friends. Mwah. Sorry about all the technical difficulties today. Bleh.